Hello and welcome to the Management with Impact podcast from the Department of Management at the London School of Economics and Political Science with me, Danny Marenghi. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sue Lee, Assistant Professor of Management in the Organisational Behaviour Faculty Research Group. In this episode we discuss Dr. Lee's paper, When Breaking the Law Gets You the Job, Evidence from the Electronic Dance Music Community, which was recently published in Administrative Science Quarterly. Dr. Sue Lee, can you explain a bit about how you came to this topic and your main findings on the paper?
It's actually a quite interesting story. So at the time when I started the project, I actually lived in Berlin, and that was my first job as a professor. So I was very lucky because I have a very good student who was a DJ at the time and who was quite active in the Berlin scene. And I also happened to live in a neighborhood with many of the techno clubs that I was not aware of. So I was very intrigued by the scene in general. And I think one question that always makes me feel curious is that there are so many young people who claim to be DJs in Berlin, but how could they get jobs? How could they stand out among this very competitive field of all the talents who try to really get those limited number of gigs? So it all started from there, and then the student, whose name is Claudio, actually ended up doing a master's thesis with me. So I got to know much more about the scene, and then I decided to do something about it. And that's sort of the beginning point of this project. And then my co-author at the time, Amadine, who was a professor at Yale, and she's been a friend of mine for a long time. We did our PhD together. She came to visit me in Berlin, and she's also very much intrigued by, this entire phenomenon of DJs competing for gigs. So we started doing something, seriously about it at the time. We collected a lot of data. So in this paper, we were able to actually capture the information on over 38,000 DJs over about 100 countries in a 10-year period. So what we were trying to study is, how do DJs stand and how do they get gigs? What are some of the important factors that, enhance their chance of getting gigs? One of the very surprising findings here, as you mentioned briefly earlier, is that we actually find out among all the DJs, those who were remixing music illegally are the ones who's getting the most jobs. Obviously, this finding itself is rather counterintuitive, because in many different communities, you would assume that for individuals who are following the laws, they should be rewarded. But in this situation, in this particular context, opposite to our common understanding, we actually find out it was the lawbreakers who were rewarded by the community with the most gigs. So in this paper, we're really trying to understand both quantitatively with data, but also qualitatively through interviews with DJs to understand how this happened in the first place.
And so by, you say, breaking the law, breaking the rules, what do you mean by that? I read from the paper, it's illegally remixing music that already exists. So essentially, in too many words, breaking copyright law and taking another person's work and using it in their own.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if you're familiar with the EDM scene. So many of the artists, they have different ways to produce music and put their music out there. Of course, we know that one of the most common ways for DJs to produce music is to remix other people's work. For instance, we see DJs remixing, Madonna's work or any other DJ's work. So the legal way of doing so is that before you remix anyone's music track, you should reach out to either the artist or their agent to get the legal approval, because you're essentially using other people's copyrighted materials. And this has to go through a legal procedure. And once you get the approval from the artist or their agent or their labels, you would get the stem music MIDI files that allows you to really work on the file and then remix music. But obviously, not all the DJs will be able to get the approval. Some of them might not even know they need to get the approval. So we have lots of DJs who are actually remixing music from other artists without consent. So that's what we call illegal remixing or bootleg, within the scene. In essence, these artists were just simply remixing and creating new music using others' tracks without their approval. So this is clearly illegal according to copyright laws in most countries.
And you say that they were rewarded based on their activity of illegally remixing other people's music, and that came in the form of an increased number of gigs.
Yeah.
And how kind of quantifiable was that? How noticeable was the difference in those illegally remixing versus those who were, say, making original music?
I think it's important to point out that they were not always rewarded. So I think one of the main contribution or the interesting finding of the paper is that we're really trying to highlight that there are sometimes inconsistencies or In other words, the formal and the informal regulations within different communities might not be perfectly aligned. So let me give you one other example in a different context. For instance, within chefs, who's working in Michelin-star restaurants, legally, there's no law saying that you cannot copy others' recipes. But clearly, within the community, if you are a chef who's copying other people's recipe, your career pretty much is screwed. You shouldn't do that. So in the EDM scene, it's similar, but it's sort of the opposite. As we mentioned earlier, on paper, according to the copyright law of many countries, you are not allowed to infringe other people's music right without, getting approval. But because practically sometimes it might not be possible to get approval, or some people are not aware of that. There's different ways of doing this. What we find out here is that despite the DJs violating the law without getting the approval of the original tracks, what really matters in the evaluation from the community side is the intention of why they would actually do this bootlegging. So sometimes, when a DJ probably, for instance, just starting their career, they don't know what to do, or it's just difficult to get approval from a big artist. They have to do it to put their music out there. The intent behind the bootlegging is much more innocent. It's not about deliberately trying to violate the law or just, trying to advance their own career. The intention here, as I said earlier, is rather naive. Or is it about really creating music and showing to the people in the scene that I can do this? I'm passionate about music. In this situation, we say that is more what we call academically a bit of a disinterested action, meaning that they are doing so to sort of value the core value of the profession and not to do this to advance their own careers, to do this for any kind of personal purposes. But in other situations, you could still do the bootlegging, remixing illegally. If you have bad intentions, you're doing this to sort of tap into some kind of trend or just to promote yourself, the outcome, as we observed, is actually quite different. So despite on average, we did find out that, bootlegging leads to more career opportunities. It really depends on the intentions of the DJs. And we were able to differentiate in our analysis that in some situations, bootlegging is indeed rewarded. It helps DJs to sort of, jumpstart their career. But in other situations, it could also backfire. What really matters here is why do they do this in the first place?
And you said that, I read in your paper that you said this is one of the bits that makes your paper stand out from the extant research is the kind of level, the intention of the DJ. And you said that those who might then do it out of a more selfish reason to kind of promote their own career, would you see that they get then a negative reaction from the community in terms of not getting booked for gigs?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because, not only from our data we showed, for instance, the DJ has very high status, who's already very famous, and somehow they still do bootleg. People would question, why do they do that? I mean, they have all the resources, they have their label company who's able to help them clear the copyright laws. Why do they still do bootleg illegally? Are they taking advantage of other DJs? So there's a lot of doubts about is there any need for them to even engage in this kind of illegal behaviors. So we do observe sometimes it will reduce the number of their gigs in the future. And in other situations, for instance, we also observe, if a DJ has done official remix before, so they should know all the drills. They know they need to get the approval, they need to talk to the original copyright holder. And if they have the experience, and they still do illegal bootlegging, it also triggers concerns from the community about their motivation. And in the end, it also reflects in a reduced number of gigs. So there does appear to be some kind of backlashes. And if people perceive your intention as questionable. But this kind of question were not sort of raised when people feel that the DJ was actually doing this for the love of music. When they have very low status, when they don't have a record label yet, or when they have never remixed anything officially before. And in that case, the community tend to interpret the DJ's intention of bootlegging as more naive or disinterested, as we mentioned earlier. It's more about showing their passion for music rather than any kind of personal gains.
That's interesting, because I read about a paper that, an example that you used of Imam Bek, who was a DJ in, where was it, like Kazakhstan?
Kazakhstan, yeah.
Kazakhstan, it was Kazakhstan. And he was an amateur kind of DJ and remixed another artist's work, and actually led to him getting a lot of success in the community. I wonder, does the kind of view of being disinterested persist if they gain recognition? So Imam Beck saw success as an amateur, illegally bootlegging another artist's work to further his goal, for the love of the music, which is why he was rewarded with kind of recognition. But then if someone becomes a famous DJ, do they kind of lose the privilege, if you will, of being able to bootleg?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you, because that's sort of what our finding suggests implicitly, right? I mean, we have the indication of DJ status, or their whether they have signed a record label. I think to a certain extent, and these indications shows how much resource they have, how much knowledge they have in terms of how should we do things properly, right? In the legal way. And in these situations, when they do have the resource, as we have heard from our interviewees, that when you have a label company handling all these copyright issues for you, when you already are famous, have tons of money and resources that allow you to clear the copyright, and also even the connections with other DJs, why would you still do it illegally, right? And that certainly casts a lot of doubts, behind your intention of bootlegging. And that's when we observe, actually, the benefit of bootlegging will reduce over time once the DJ become more established, as indicated by their status, or they're signing under a record label.
Just touching a final bit on the actual kind of practice of breaking the law and doing a bootleg, whose kind of choice is it then to not pursue the bootlegger if the kind of community acknowledges that, yes, this is an illegal act in practice, but in principle we're not going to pursue you? Is it kind of an informal community enforced pass that they give to DJs?
Yeah, that's sort of part of the interesting thing from this research, is that whether we're going to enforce a law seems to be more based on the discretion of the copyright holder, right? And as you mentioned, the case of Imam Beck, and I think it's a very interesting and inspiring story for people who don't know. He actually went on to win a Grammy for the illegal remix that he has done. And in this case, the original artist that he remixed is Sanctioned, who had this wonderful piece of music called Roses. And the original piece of the track was actually not as famous as the illegal track eventually. And in this case, Sanctioned could have, sued Imam Beck for infringing his copyright or his record label, right? But they chose not to. But in this case, I think, as we discussed in the paper, it's probably due to, the innocence or the innocent intention of Imam Beck in the beginning. And I remember in one of the interviews, Imam Beck actually mentioned that he tried to reach out to Sanctioned through Instagram, but never got a reply. So he just decided to put the music out there. And in this case, it's really not about trying to push any kind of personal gain from Imam Beck's perspective. It's really about him showing that, see, I made a good piece of music and I want to share it to the world. And that eventually led to lots of success on both of their parts. And I even read that in the later days, when they achieved all the success, Sanctioned actually invited Imam Beck to even open for him for his concert. So again, as we mentioned, that within the community, of course, many of the artists that we talk to value the importance of copyright law. It helped them to protect their rights. It helped them to understand how to do things properly. But when you do encounter this situation of someone breaking the law, what I think is interesting from our finding is that it's not always about a blanket approach, that we should always penalize lawbreakers. And in this particular case, what really mattered is people trying to understand the intention of the lawbreakers. It shows that, at least in the EDM, the norm of the normative understanding of bootlegging among community members seemed to be rather ambiguous. That it seemed to be a case-by-case basis in judgment. Sometimes it is okay to do so. Other times, again, based on your intention, it might not be okay. So people seem to be quite, proficient based on our understanding in deciding what they consider to be an okay way of doing this. In other situations, it could be, backfiring for the artist themselves. So it's actually quite interesting. So there's a lot of community dynamics involved in making these evaluations. And of course, it has huge implication for the career advancement of the artists themselves.
And it has interesting implications for the kind of community and the profession. So you might, I don't know if you have any insight on this, but how would another amateur DJ who came from a similar background as Imam Beck then view bootlegging? Would he say, that's my only goal, that's my only way to get to a kind of more professional reputation or become a professional DJ? Kind of, is it seen as rewarding an illegal activity?
I think that, if you think like that, it's already sort of falling into the trap of our argument a little bit, right? And I think the main argument here is that when these artists, when they broke the law, as in the case of Imam Beck, I don't think they were thinking about, I'm breaking the law because I want to advance my career. Because when you think like that, you're already thinking about your personal gain, right? And that's the difference. So that's why, we hope that this paper shows some interesting dynamics of the community, but we certainly didn't want to provide any guidance on how anyone could break into the DJ scene. Because the moment when you start thinking about, I'm doing this to achieve something, and then it's already sort of speaking to our mechanism that it is not about disinterestedness anymore. It's about, self-serving.
Yes.
And that, in that case, most likely you'll be penalized.
That makes a lot of sense. So then you immediately become the person who's trying to do it for a selfish reason. So then the community would penalize you for that. Yes. Yeah. So a thing you mentioned earlier was chefs and kind of recipes and kind of how it might be similar across another creative industry. And I think that's easy to see how kind of a chef might steal another chef's recipe, or a comedian might steal another comedian's joke. But are there any ways that this kind of goes beyond those creative industries into the realm of other industries or like business settings?
Oh yeah, I think that we also discussed this in the paper a little bit, that we believe that we have lots of situations where the community or decision makers could benefit from understanding more, not just about the law-breaking behavior itself, but also the intention behind why people will break the law. And in different situations, the compliance could be probably more based on discretions, and the same as the punishment or the rewards, right? For instance, we talk about the example of sometimes doctors might prescribe a drug to patients to cure a certain symptom, but according to FDA, that might not be what the drug was approved for. And in that case, certainly legally, the doctor, what they were doing is not legal, because they were not, giving the drug according to FDA approval or the regulations. But the intention here is to help the patients. And in that case, should we punish the doctor or not? In my understanding, or what I believe based on our research, that it should be really based more on the intention of the doctor, right? In other situations we talk about in the paper, for instance, in bioscience research or any other kind of research context, that patent protection probably is not as rigidly enforced when people are simply trying to advance science than if you are infringing patents for profitability or gaining some kind of extra personal gains. So it really depends on the situation when you evaluate law-breaking behaviors. And I think that's also the main message of the paper, that our society and our community are rather complex. A lot of situations are rather ambiguous, and when we think about law, it tends to be more black and white. What we are seeing here is that within community, there's a lot of nuances, and in certain situations, you can't really just make judgment based on a more black and white approach. You should understand a lot of the underlying mechanisms. In this case, what we really want to emphasize is the intention behind the lawbreakers' behavior. So why do they do that, and why do they think they have to do this? So I think that's sort of the main message of the paper. There's a lot of nuances.
The kind of grey area between the black and white of
exactly.
the law.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's really interesting. And I wondered, we spoke about Imam Beck, who was from Kazakhstan, and there are other instances in the West where you see kind of, especially in the realm of music, litigations based on people who are saying, your song sounds too much like mine, I want to see you. So I just wondered, are there any differences across cultures, across societies that impact how kind of a community might respond?
Yes, certainly. And I think we actually have an interesting set of results. I don't remember it. I don't think they actually made it into the paper. It was certainly mentioned a lot in the review process. And I personally found it interesting because we do find different impacts of bootlegging across different countries, especially when you compare countries with very strong IP protection versus countries without IP protection. Because remember, we talk about in this case, the reason why many of these bootleggers, especially when they do this with a much more innocent approach, is that they were rewarded for their passion for music, right? This means that when you break the law, it has to mean something. It has to signal something. Imagine that we are in a country where there's no IP protection at all. And in this case, you could do bootlegging, but you're not breaking any law. So it also doesn't signal much about, you actually taking a risk and trying to show your passion for music. But in another country, like in the UK, there's very strict IP protection about, remixing, you should not do this and that. But in this case, if you actually do an illegal bootlegging out of innocent approaches or intentions, it actually means something. People actually feel like, oh, he or she is willing to take a risk, despite there might be repercussions, and they still want to show their passion for music. So in our finding that didn't actually make it into the paper, we sort of can interpret this finding as, this law breaking also has to mean something.
Oh, I see. So that almost there has to be the risk for the community to say, oh, I see that you've taken this risk for the community rather than there is no risk, so we won't reward you in the same way.
Exactly. So there has to be some sense of, perception of the lawbreaker actually taking a risk to pursue his or her passion. If it's in a country where there's no IP production to begin with, law breaking also doesn't mean much. So that's part of the finding that I think is also quite interesting and speak to your question a little bit about the cultural and the institutional differences across regions and to what extent law breaking could mean more or less in this different situation.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned that bit on risk didn't quite make it into the paper. So I want to know where is this kind of research going to go beyond this? Do you have anything else planned for this area?
So one of the interesting things that we sort of discovered while working on this project, and now I'm actually working on a new paper on this topic with Ahmadine, is to understand the differences between the career advancement between male and female DJs. I have to say that we interviewed a lot of DJs, and we often wonder, where are the female DJs? In our data, as I mentioned earlier, we can capture nearly 40,000 DJs over their entire career of a decade or so across 120 countries. But in these data, there's only about 10% of the DJs that identify as female or they are women DJs. So in our new project, we're really trying to understand, are there any differences in how male and female DJs present their skills and promote themselves? And more importantly, do we see any differences in their career trajectory? I can share a little bit with you the preliminary finding, which I found interesting. And in fact, to our surprise, we actually find out that when we compare male and female DJs tracking their careers, despite being in the minority, female DJs actually on average have longer careers. What's even more interesting and surprising to us is that, if we control and compare DJs at the same career stage, female DJs actually get hired to play more gigs. And these are not gigs in bad clubs. They are in comparable good clubs as the club that men are playing. So in our new project, which I won't disclose too much yet, we're trying to really understand what is causing this. So why do we observe that in these particular very much male-dominant profession, besides being the minority, female DJs seem to be doing just as good, if not better, than male DJs in their career development? So that's going to be my next project.
That sounds really interesting. And I got a few questions on that, but maybe we can wait until the new paper comes out and I'll
sounds good. Hopefully soon. Hopefully when I take too long.
We'll keep an eye out and look out for that. But is there any other profession or realm of business which you think this research could apply to, where you think there might be more investigation needed?
I think in general, within, at least in my research area, we're seeing more and more scholars trying to understand, the relation between informal and formal regulations. And if you look at how our society functions and how different professional communities regulate themselves, there's always two sets of rules. We have the, formal, the legal regulations, based on the government's law. We have a lot of informal norms and beliefs within communities. And I think that as long as there are some inconsistency between these two sets of rules, we can always find rooms in better understanding how people either comply to the formal laws or the informal beliefs within communities. And there got to be some tension between the two. So I believe that, if you look at any profession, even in academic, where we are in, there seems to be a lot of tension between these two sets of rules. And that's why I believe, there's a lot of room for us to do further research, understanding the relation between formal and informal regulations, and to further sort of understand, especially with our research, where can we apply these kind of intention-based evaluation of law breaking into different settings.
That sounds really interesting, and you've chosen a very fun kind of industry to research this topic of informal norms versus formal laws in.
Yeah.
Have you had the chance to go to any big EDM gigs while you're doing this project?
I think that's part of the benefit of working on this, and I have to say that I'm very lucky that I have a lot of friends who are supporting me on this project, especially, as I mentioned earlier, one of my students, Claudio Marte, who has been extremely supportive, and he is now also an up-and-coming DJ and promoter in Berlin. He has his own collective, and for my new projects, and he's also helping me to recruit a lot of DJs for interviews. And I think that I don't think I'm a very cool person, but with the help of these students and friends, I was able to be exposed to a really vibrant community of artists. And I think there's a lot of surprises and we all think about different things with some kind of stereotypical belief in mind. But when I talk to more and more DJs, I feel like, I can't do what they're doing. One big surprise I want to share with you is that many of them, given how competitive the industry is, have full-time jobs on the side. And a lot of them are actually very successful. And many of them are very strategic, and they really sort of think through in how to promote themselves and how to approach their music and how to approach their career development. I have to say that I think that I'm very impressed by many of the artists we talk to, and I think that to survive in that highly competitive and creative profession is not an easy task, and I'm really in awe with many of their accomplishments. Yeah.
Amazing. So we can end it there. Sue, thank you very much for sitting down with me today, and I'll look forward to that new paper coming out, and maybe we can have another chat then.
Thank you. I look forward to that as well. Yeah. Hopefully it will happen soon.
Thank you very much.